Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. It's a beautiful sunny day. A couple of very quick announcements. We're recording the session, so please be aware of that when you come to ask questions, if you're happy to do that. Tomorrow afternoon, you'll be aware that we're watching the film Don't Look Up. We've got the film showing in Newlyn Cinema. It's 2 o'clock, and at the moment we've got 16 people booked in, so there's more that can join us. That'd be great. After that, we've got Amanda Brookman, who's going to lead us in what we might describe as a film review up at the Newlyn Centre with cake from Pippa. And on Saturday, because we know you haven't got enough on, at 1 o'clock we're doing a dog walk, the Great Western Dog Walk, and this is to raise awareness for brain tumours and raise money for brain tumour and brain tumour support. On Thursday, the 21st of April, our next meeting, we've got Mel Watson from the council, who's going to be talking to us about the Cornwall bus pilot.
Bugger.
You may, can you mute people? You may remember that Cornwall secured 23.5 million to do this pilot a couple of years ago. COVID obviously delayed the start of it, but that starts next month. Mel's going to be talking to us about how that should encourage people on the buses. So that's the 21st of April, 5 o'clock, but we will send that information. Now, I'm really delighted to firstly welcome everyone, but also in particular to welcome the president of COP26, Alok Sharma. Alok, what we'd like to hear from you is a little bit about your role with the COP26 conference itself, how that came about and what you felt was achieved. But also, and that was a difficult task for you, but my guess is that your job has become a whole lot more difficult now because of the various things that are going on the last 6 to 7 weeks. And so if you're able to talk through a little bit about what your job continues to be this year as president of COP26, but also your job within cabinet, if you've got time for that. And then with your permission, we'll take questions from the chat function, and hopefully you'll be able to answer them as freely as you want to. So Alok, really appreciate, and it's great to have you. Thank you for getting the date back in the diary so quickly. Over to you, sir.
Great. Well, Derek, thank you very much. And firstly, to say thank you for everything that you do, Derek, in Parliament and obviously in your constituency as well, in terms of advancing the green agenda. I know it's something that is very close to your heart. As you said, we have the COP presidency up until Sharm el-Sheikh in November, and I took on this role full time at the start of last year. And if I sort of fast forward to November 2021, I mean, you know, we were living even then in a pretty fractured world, and lots of international disagreements on a whole range of issues. And yet, what we were able to do. Sorry, can you just hang on 1 minute? I just need to say something to one of my colleagues who's moving around. Yeah, sorry. So I was just saying that we were living in a pretty fractured world, and yet what we managed to do was to get almost 200 countries to sign up to the Glasgow Climate Pact. And I think the reason for this is because we as a country had spent 2 years building trust around the world. And you know, many of you will have watched the final hours of COP26. And I can tell you it was pretty tense, and maybe as we get into the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about that. But the reason we eventually managed to get this thing over the line is because countries trusted the UK, that we were doing the right thing, that we were ensuring that all voices were heard. And, you know, we talk a lot about Global Britain. For me, this was a great practical example of Global Britain in action, bringing the world together on this incredibly important issue of climate. Now, just to outline some of the key things that we got over the line in Glasgow, obviously, we ensured that there was more money flowing to climate finance to support developing countries. We ensured that we've now got 90% of the global economy committed to a net zero target. You know, before we took on the mantle of organizing COP26, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. And what we've also managed to do is to get every country to sign up to looking again at their 2030 emission reduction targets and coming back by the end of this year, if necessary, to make sure that those are aligned with the Paris goals. And then, you know, for the first time ever at any COP, we got a commitment from every country that they would phase down the use of coal in their domestic economies as well. So there's a whole range of things, and I think as we go through the discussion, I'm sure we will reach into this. But you know, the overall goal that we had going into COP26 was to be able to say with credibility that we kept the goal of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees within reach. And I do think with credibility we can say that. You know, before the Paris Agreement came in place, the science was telling us that we were heading north of 4 degrees of global warming by the end of this century. Post-Paris, with the commitments that were made, we were heading towards 3 degrees, and now we are heading towards below 2 degrees. But of course, what it requires is all the countries who have made commitments to actually deliver on them. And that, exactly as you say, Derek, is a big part of what I and others have to do ensures happens this year. I just sort of want to touch upon one particular issue around this, which is that I think everyone on this call is obviously incredibly informed about these issues. But you know, I'm sort of often asked by people, well, you know, 1.5 degrees doesn't sound like a great deal. And then what you say to people is that, you know, the science is telling us that we are already 1.1 degrees in terms of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And we see the impact of that around the world. I mean, you know, we will have seen images during last year of terrible flooding in Europe, terrible flooding in China. You'll have seen the wildfires that were raging in North America, in Australia, and you know, even in our own country, we know the growing impact of a changing climate. And more recently, in the last few weeks, we had another IPCC report, which was again incredibly stark reminder of why we need to ensure that we are speeding up the action we take on addressing climate change. And to just give you a couple of sort of proof points, if I can put it like that, is that you know, even if we were to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees, I'm afraid it is still going to be very, very, very difficult for millions of people around the world. So at 1.5 degrees, if we were to get there, it would mean 700 million people across the world living in extreme heat. If we got to 2 degrees, you're talking about 2 billion people. If we get to 1.5 degrees, 70% of the coral reefs in the world are gone. At 2 degrees, they're just about virtually all gone. And there are a whole range of these scenarios that are set out based on the science. So, you know, it's vitally important that we get to grips with this issue. And last year, I had the privilege, the honor to visit a range of countries, many of them on the front line of climate change. And you know, what I was able to see is really the harrowing experience that people have had as a result of the changing climate. I was in Barbuda, and this was an island that was hit by a hurricane called Hurricane Irma back in 2017. And actually standing in the middle of that island 4 years on and looking around, it literally felt like a hurricane had come in a few weeks earlier. Roofs blown off many of the buildings, walls crumbling, and actually many people effectively forced to migrate from their homes away from the island because of this particular hurricane. And when I spoke to people who were still there, you know, what they said to me is that their huge concern, apart from rebuilding the infrastructure that they need to rebuild, is that climate events are becoming more frequent and more ferocious. And their sort of message to the biggest emitters in the world, the G20 nations, is that they have to do more in terms of cutting their emissions. The 20 biggest economies in the world responsible for 80% of emissions. I was in Nepal, where I met communities who were literally driven from their homes from a combination of drought and flooding due to melting glaciers. And actually, just a few weeks ago, I was in Jakarta, and I went to see the seawall. So they're building they have built a seawall around parts of Jakarta because of the rising sea levels. And due to a combination of water abstraction and rising sea levels, basically they are seeing 20%, up to 20 centimeters increase in sea levels around Jakarta. And if you look at this wall, you can literally see where every few years more has been added, and it gives you a really terrifying look into the future about where we are headed if we don't address climate change. And now there is of course a huge environmental cost of a changing climate, but there are also other cascading risks. So if you look at the impact of a changing climate in terms of food security, in terms of water security, in terms of potential for people to be forced from their homes, all of this with a changing climate just exacerbates existing risks that are out there and many countries are experiencing. And there is a big economic cost to this. So, many of you will be familiar with the work that Lord Stern has done, a great man who he sort of really supported us through the COP agenda. But he brought out a report some years ago which said that in the circumstances of unmitigated climate change, you were looking at up to 20% reduction in global GDP a year. Our own independent forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, put out a risk report last year. And basically they said that, again, under the circumstances of unmitigated climate change, we could see our national debt go to 289% of GDP. I mean, I am someone who believes we have to be fiscally responsible. And, we have to deal with this issue now, because not only are we then sort of heading towards a environmental catastrophe, but you're also going to end up burdening future generations with unsustainable levels of debt. So, what is the answer to this in terms of the agenda that we need to follow? And that is very much about green growth. And, one of the very many pleasing things coming out of COP26 is that we saw not only big commitments from government, but we also saw commitments from business as well. And the business community around the world has completely understood that not only is this the right thing to do in terms of tackling climate change and following a path for green growth, but it's what their clients and customers want, but it's also really pretty good for the bottom line. And so at Glasgow, we had $130 trillion of financial assets committing to go to net zero by 2050. I mean, that's, just to put it in context, that's 40% of financial assets in the world right now. And I think that trend is absolutely going to continue. And in the UK, of course, we set out our own net zero strategy before COP26. And that is all about ensuring that we are creating jobs, good green jobs in the sunrise industries of the future, in our industrial heartlands. And so our plan is to create over 400,000 jobs by 2030. We want to ensure that we're getting £90 billion of private investment into the UK, and you're already seeing that happen around the country. You're seeing investment in electric vehicle factories. You're seeing investment in gigafactories. You're seeing huge amounts of investment going into renewables in the UK. So we have, over a pretty short period of time, built the biggest, second biggest offshore wind sector in the world, and we're looking to grow that significantly over the next few years as well. So I think, coming out of COP, I think there is momentum behind following a net zero agenda and making sure that we're pursuing green growth and creating these jobs. But Derek, you started with saying that my job this year, the UK's job, is also really very challenging. And you're absolutely right. We see the geopolitics right now with Putin's illegal and frankly incredibly brutal invasion of Ukraine. And right now, it's absolutely right that we stand shoulder to shoulder with the brave people of Ukraine. And frankly, no one can fail to be moved by the harrowing images that are emerging every day out of Ukraine. And it's absolutely right that the international community is focused on this issue. But we know from the IPCC reports that have come out, and more will come out during this year, that I'm afraid the chronic condition of climate change has not gone away, and things will get worse. So during this year, I'm continuing to work with governments around the world to make sure that they deliver on the commitments that they've made. And one of the biggest commitments, of course, is for countries to look again at their 2030 emission reduction targets. So I hope we will see more progress on that in Sharm el-Sheikh in November this year. And actually, the fact that we have so many of you here as well, I think shows that there is a huge appetite for this agenda within civil society. And I have to say to you, one of the reasons we were able to get strong commitments from governments and businesses at COP26 is precisely because of people like you on this call, because of the strong voice of civil society urging business, urging governments to go forward. So, you know, in concluding, I would say, please continue to raise your voice, continue to hold government to account, continue to hold businesses to account. That's how we're going to continue to make progress over this critical decade up to 2030.
Alok, thank you ever so much for that. That's brilliant. And thank you for being so candid, but also quite brief. That's brilliant. So we've got about 40 minutes, and I'm going to go straight to Rupert Mansell. Alok, one of the commitments, I believe, for the Paris Climate Change Agreement was about how we inform, how governments inform the public and take the public with us. And I guess, Rupert, that's the point of your question. So over to you, Rupert. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks very much, Derek and Alok, for your presentation. It's indeed extremely challenging. And my question is quite simple. Is it time for the government to be honest and admit that we need to fundamentally change the way we live and shift to a well-being driven rather than growth-dependent economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rupert. Look, I mean, I think, as I said to you, one of the things that we in the UK have demonstrated is that you can grow your economy and you can cut emissions at the same time. And when I have talked to governments around the world, they, they do see the UK as a climate leader. They do see us as a country that is demonstrating green growth. One of the things that came out of COP26 was obviously more funding to support developing countries, but what we also announced was a specific agreement to support South Africa. South Africa is a growing economy. They have significant energy needs, and I have to say to you, I don't think we can say to countries around the world that you must curb your growth. I think what we need to do is to support them with their own clean transition and actually leapfrog some of the dirty technologies that the developed world has used as part of our own sort of growth process. So last week I co-chaired a meeting with the German, one of my German sort of ministerial colleagues, who Germany, as you know, hold the presidency of the G7 this year. And we brought together G7 ministers, we brought together many of the multilateral development banks and also the private sector to see how we can try and mobilize more finance in developing economies around the world. So, I have to say to you, I think it is, from my perspective at least, and we may have a differing view on this, but from my perspective, I don't think you can say to people that we should just curb our growth. I think what we need to do is to ensure that we are demonstrating green growth. And I said, we've done that in the UK. There are technologies out there. There are more being developed, and I think that is the way forward.
Sure. Am I allowed to come back on that just
Please.
briefly?
Yeah, be brief, Rupert, so we get.
And it's just simply to make the point that while the economy is largely fueled by carbon, it simply isn't possible to have growth without harming the environment. And we urgently need to leapfrog and build capacity in the green sector. Thank you.
So Rupert, look, I think we very much agree on this. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, you will all have some of the national grid apps that are out there which show you what percentage of the energy that we're using in our electricity mix right now at any one point is from zero carbon sources. And I haven't looked at what it is today, but I think generally you will find that on some days we're at sort of over 50% of the electricity that we're using to generate the energy we're using to generate our electricity is from zero carbon sources. So I talked about offshore wind, solar, hydro, and of course nuclear as well. Back in 2020, at the end of 2020, we set out something called our Green Industrial Strategy. I was our Business and Energy Secretary at the time. That set out our blueprint for how we want to cut emissions across different sectors, but at the same time grow the economy. So, I mean, Rupert, you and I are very much aligned on the fact that we need to decarbonize our economy. But I think in terms of growth, that is something that I very much support. But obviously, we need to do this in a green way.
Okay.
Right. Well, I would like to pick up on a question, or it's more of a statement from Lynn Jones, saying that the government discourages energy efficiency improvements by subjecting them to a high rate of VAT. I mean, in Cornwall especially, we know about the need for home insulation. But she says that in Italy, the government provides a remarkable 110% of the cost of home energy improvements. And this pays for everything: insulation, ventilation, new windows and doors. Could we do better in funding home insulation is really the question.
Yeah, so Pippa, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think, Pippa, you might need to go on mute because otherwise there's an echo.
Sorry.
I echo. I can hear an echo myself. Thank you very much for that. What we had in 2020 was we introduced a Green Homes grant, but a significant portion of that money was actually aimed not just at households or private households, but also at ensuring that we were helping to insulate public sector homes. We were making sure that they were more energy efficient, and actually there was a lot of money that was deployed through that. There are obviously grants out there to ensure that individuals are helped in adopting green technologies. So, for instance, there is a grant for people who want to buy zero-emission vehicles. There is going to be a grant coming through for people who want to buy heat pumps. Yeah, look, I mean, I've always been someone who's advocated sort of carrot rather than stick in all of these approaches. You'll have seen in the spring statement yesterday, the Chancellor also made an announcement on solar. I mean, you raised this issue of VAT, and I think he made a really good announcement there in terms of which basically represents a green tax cut. So, of course, we can always be doing more, but I think as a government, we absolutely understand this particular issue. And I said there are a number of grants out there, and I obviously very much hope that individuals and businesses take up some of the grants that are being put forward.
Thank you, Alok. And also in the statement yesterday, Pippa, basically zero VAT for insulation, heat pumps, and solar now. So that's, I mean, it was 5% before, so that's an improvement. But Alok, I think you would agree that some of the schemes we've had where we've tried to do homes haven't worked that well, and we've seen in Cornwall just not enough tradesmen actually in a position to do the work. So we import, or we don't, but tradesmen import themselves down into Cornwall, do a job that we probably wouldn't be proud of, and then clear off and leave the mess behind them. So we need to find, I think what we all recognise, including in government, I think, we need to find better ways of genuinely improving or retrofitting our homes. Okay, so I haven't actually been... Could
I come in on that?
Yeah, go on then, yes.
Okay, sorry to interrupt there, but I was just checking if my thing's working. My name's Dennis Stevens. I'm a chartered environmentalist. I'm a chartered architectural technologist. I worked for 25 years in the social housing sector on raising the energy efficiency standards of housing. And I've got a lot of experience in that field. I can see there are some great things in the net zero strategy, But our construction in the industry in this country is nothing like developed enough to even begin to approach the size of the task that's involved in what's in that strategy. And I know from talking with people in the business, certainly in Cornwall, that we've had businesses start up and go bust because there wasn't enough work for them to do. Businesses need an ongoing supply of work. We need businesses that can actually go out and do external wall insulation or internal wall insulation. In Cornwall, we've got very hard to heat homes that you cannot put a heat pump in without actually improving the insulation. The amount of construction work is vast, and the infrastructure needed for it is vast. And I'd really like to know what the government is going to do to actually encourage that to happen, because I've spent 25 years watching it not happen, and I would so love to see it happen now.
Thanks, Dennis. Alok.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think, I mean, I'll just point out that obviously my responsibility relates to COP26 and an international agenda, and I completely understand that we're moving on to domestic policy. And whilst obviously I have a sort of great deal of interest in this, this is not my area of responsibility. So what I don't want to do is to speak for other government departments. I would just make a general point, which is that I think when governments, any government sort of introduces policies where you want individuals to take up a particular grant, or you want individuals to focus on a particular area. Of course, you want to make sure that those are long-term policies and the programs that are put in place are long-term as well, because I think the point you were making, I think, is a really important one, which is that if you give certainty to businesses in terms of the longevity of schemes, they will invest, they will make sure that they employ people. So I think that is a point well made, and certainly on a personal level, I recognise that.
Alok, thanks very much. I'm hoping to get back onto your area of responsibility, but if it's not, then do tell us. So Claire Taylor, can you ask your question about the embodied emissions for imports?
Yes, thank you for being here, Mr. Sharma. You stated that we have been reducing our emissions over the years, but we don't count the emissions from imports, the embodied emissions. So a lot of our reduction has come from offshoring manufacturing. Will future calculations include the embodied emissions?
Alok, before you respond to that, I think the way we can connect it to your current responsibility is obviously if we do that, we can encourage the countries that manufacture things we use possibly to reach their targets as well. Hopefully you don't mind me adding that, Claire.
No, absolutely fine. Thank you for that, and thank you, Claire, for the question. So, I mean, what we're talking about in this question, I think, is that broader issue of carbon leakage and carbon pricing, and there is no doubt that this is a big international agenda item. And in the UK, so at the end of 2020, we set out a emissions trading scheme. We were part of the EU scheme. We obviously had to set up our own scheme, and we did that when I was business secretary. And I do think actually that it is a pretty good scheme that we have up and running. But you will know that the EU, for instance, has set out its plans and thoughts for a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And there is a lot of thinking going on across governments about how do you deal precisely with this issue of carbon leakage. As part of the German G7 presidency, one of the things that they are talking about is whether we ought to be looking at climate clubs where countries which are like-minded sort of come together. I mean, all of this, I think, is part of an international discussion right now. Ideally, what will happen over time is that we will reach an international agreement on this issue. But you raised a very valid point. What I can't give you here is a sort of precise answer, because I think this is part of the evolving international narrative on this. But the one thing everyone has recognized is that we're going to have to deal with this issue of carbon leakage, and we're going to have to deal with the issue of carbon pricing if we are ultimately going to make sure that, as very many countries have committed to do, to go to net zero by the middle of the century. I mean, as I said to you, and I've spoken to many governments, I continue to speak to many governments. I mean, take China, for instance. I mean, China has introduced its own emissions trading scheme, and it gives you some sense of the fact that, you know, economies around the world understand this is an issue that is going to have to be addressed sooner rather than later.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Maggie Freegard to ask her question, which is about, do you think the government has a role in educating the general public in this? And it's my understanding that they do, and that it's part of the various climate accords. So perhaps, Maggie, you would like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yes. Well, people attending this conference this afternoon have all made the effort to educate themselves about the effects of climate change and the issues around it. But the majority of people in the country, our country, the UK, have not. And they are the ones that vote you as a party in. And I think that's why you don't want, I know you understand it. I know that you personally understand it extremely well. But the majority of people doing the voting do not. Do you think that government has a role to play here to educate everybody so that they do vote for those policies, so they do vote for the party that takes us down this rather uncomfortable journey where we're going to have to change a lot of the things that we do that currently account for carbon emissions? Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. So, I mean, as you say, you know, people who are on this conference, this call, you know, obviously understand these issues in a lot of detail. But what I would say to you is that there's a lot of polling out there, not just in our country, but also internationally, which shows that actually this issue of tackling climate change, you know, cleaning up our environment, having a healthier future for our children and grandchildren, it does resonate very much around the world. And you know, I'm happy through Derek to share with you, you know, some of the polling internationally that is out there. But I do think actually people get it, and frankly, that's been part of also driving, you know, governments and businesses. So in the lead up to COP26, we were very keen that we set up a forum for civil society and youth to come together and effectively work with us with the COP26 presidency in terms of planning for COP, in terms of discussing the you know, the big agenda items that mattered. And you know, when we set this up a couple of years ago, I mean, I'll be very frank with you. I think some of those civil society members were probably a little bit cynical. I mean, they thought, well, you know, has the UK government just done this so that they can say they've talked and listened to civil society and youth? I hope what they would say to you now is that they were integral to COP26. There was a big platform for civil society and youth at COP26. And you know, that is something that we want to ensure happens at every COP going forward. So on the specific issue of educating people, again, through Derek, we can send you details on this, but you know, our colleague Nadeem Zahawi was at COP26, along with actually very many of the cabinet, because as you know, we had theme days, and there was a day where we covered issues on youth, and he set out a plan for what the UK government is doing, the Department for Education is doing, in terms of advancing this particular agenda itself across schools. So we're happy to share all that with you. So I mean, I genuinely believe from all the conversations that I've had going around the world, and I've always made a point where I possibly can to meet youth groups and civil society groups and hear directly from them. I can tell you, Maggie, this is an issue that resonates across the world. And I think that resonance will actually grow as people, you know, very sadly see the increased impact of a changing climate around the world.
Thank you, Alok. I met with Tear Fund yesterday, and that's a number of meetings I had since G7, because Alok, you'll know that G7, the summit took place in our constituency. And the Tier Fund are doing incredible work around the world with young people, and they're continuing that work. And as you know, we're up at COP26 as well. But John Challenger asked a really good question, and this is about, and I'd be interested to know, Alok, if once John asks his question, whether this is at all a conversation that happens at a conference like COP26 or in your work now as the president for this year. So over to you. This is about population, John. Is John here? Oh, I can read it. Basically, John, are you in? Alok, basically the question is, in wanting to work out how we get to the targets that you clearly set out, does population growth, is that an important part of the discussion, and managing population growth, does that come into your debates and discussion?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a very sort of interesting question, and Derek, obviously, you know, I've had letters from fellow members of Parliament whose constituents have written in on this particular issue, and you know, what is the linkage? I mean, I think there are various sort of studies out there which suggest that actually the key issue here is about consumption, and it's consumption that ultimately is driving this. But it isn't just consumption; it's basically how is it that those goods that are being produced, and whether they're being produced in a clean way or frankly in a way that are connected with emissions. And again, I think this links back to the you know, important point that I think Claire was making, this issue about you know, carbon leakage, this issue about how do we deal with that particular issue. So you know, I guess in summary terms, the issue I think is probably focused much more on levels of consumption, and you know, the reality is that in developed countries, the level of consumption per capita is significantly higher than in very many developing countries as well. I mean, if you look at you know, global emissions around the world, Africa obviously has a significant percentage of the world's population, but actually a small fraction of total global emissions come from Africa.
Thank you. I'd like to invite Caroline Snow to ask her question, because she's asking whether the COP process can actually stop the way we are now looking again because of high gas and oil prices and turning away from Russian hydrocarbons, whether the COP process can actually stop this becoming another investment in fossil fuels. Caroline.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Sharma, for all that you're doing. Yeah, I'm really concerned that the desire to turn away from Russian hydrocarbons and high gas and oil prices is stimulating renewed investment in fossil fuels. For example, the new fields in the North Sea and Cambo, and slowing the transition away from fossil fuels. Antonio Guterres said that the madness of this rush for fossil fuels is closing the window on 1.5. Can the COP process stop this? Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I think a very important point. I've just actually this afternoon returned from Paris, where I was at the meeting of the International Energy Agency, where they had energy ministers from around the world come together. And I had an opportunity to address the ministers yesterday evening. And I made the point that, you know, right now, yeah, every government is having to look to see how they deal with the acute energy crisis that there is. And you know, obviously, if you are in government, you need to make sure that, you know, firstly, of course, you're keeping your population safe, but then also when it comes to energy, that, you know, the lights stay on, that people are able to get their homes heated. And of course, in the UK, as in other countries, support is being announced for helping people with the issue of cost of living and the significant rise in you know, gas prices and electricity prices. But I also made the point that what we need to ensure is that we still keep our eye on the ball when it comes to our medium and long-term goals. And of course, you know, I said to you that we managed, as a result of the work that we did, to get 90% of the global economy committed to a net zero target. We've got 18 out of the 20 biggest economies in the world committed to a net zero target. When we started this COP process, if I was, on a similar call and I said, you know what, by the time we get to COP26, the UK will have worked with others to ensure that 90% of the global economy is covered by a net zero target, I don't think very many people would have believed me, quite frankly, but we managed to do that. We managed for the first time to get the G20 to ensure that they're not financing any more international coal projects. We've got every country to agree to phase down the use of coal domestically. So there is a momentum behind this. And I said to ministers that we need to keep in mind the fact that we have made that commitment to net zero, and we're going to have to honor that. But actually, if you have a look at the pronouncements that have been coming out of governments, people are talking about accelerating renewables, right? I mean, in the UK, for instance, we've had a big push on renewables. We've announced that we're going to sort of grow our renewable sector significantly. We are putting more funding behind nuclear, behind hydrogen, and if there is a silver lining from this sort of dreadful war and all the suffering that is taking place in Ukraine, I think it is a realization that countries are going to have to wean themselves off Russian hydrocarbons, and one of the best ways of doing that in the medium to long term is to make sure you accelerate on renewables. So I do think that will happen, and I think it will accelerate that move towards a clean energy transition.
Alok, thanks for that. John James has got a question that really picks up or adds to what you've just said, so hopefully you don't feel you have to repeat yourself. But I guess what John is saying is just identifying the massive challenge that you've got as you continue this job this year. So over to you, John.
Yes, my question is, despite all those commitments given at COP26, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that enough countries are actually implementing policies. They're saying the right things, but are they implementing those policies to reach that target of 1.5 degrees? And what makes you think that countries are going to implement the policies that they say they will? Because there have been many policy announcements in the past, and they've never been followed through.
Yeah, I think that is a fair challenge, John. So I mean, that's part of what I and my team are doing this year, is working with Egypt as the presidency of the COP27 and other countries to make sure that we get these commitments delivered upon. One of the things that we did, I think, quite successfully last year is to work through forums like the G7, like the G20, like the UN General Assembly. And that again is something that we're very keen to do this year as well. But every COP delivers a bit more and provides a stepping stone. My personal view is that Glasgow is a very big stepping stone into the next COP, and it is a sort of an iterative process. But I go back to the point that I made at the start, which is that if you look at the trajectory of where the science tells us we are heading in terms of global temperature rises, before Paris, I mean, you will know this. Many of you will have studied this in some detail. There were predictions that we were going to be, well north of 4 degrees. Certainly, some of the scientific predictions were heading there. Post Paris, 3 degrees, and now, if you look at the report that the IEA brought out at the during last year, during the time of COP. Basically, they concluded that we were now, as a result of the commitments that have been made, heading towards 1.8 degrees. So we're not at sort of 1.5, and we need to make sure that we keep pushing. And that's why we got that commitment from countries to try and do more in terms of 2030 reduction targets. But ultimately, this is also being driven by the whole issue of growth, right? I mean, there is literally a global race in clean technologies. So whether that's battery technology, whether that is hydrogen, if you're carbon capture storage, every country is looking to see what more they can do, because they know that there is a big economic dividend in getting this right. And I think that's what gives me hope as well, is that there is a realization that ultimately this is, of course, about cleaning up the environment, but also there is an economic dividend if we get this right. But I mean, let me give you an assurance, John, is that we are not letting up. I'm not letting up. We are continuing to press governments. One of the reasons I was in Paris earlier today.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to pick out questions that are specifically about COP26, and I'm going to ask Lynn Jones to ask her question about what do you think about forgiving low-income country debt. Lynn.
Thank you, Pippa. It follows on actually from what you were saying. Again, you know, how hard are you going to push, Mr. Sharma, in Egypt for loss and damage? Because really there was a lot of pulling away from that. And you talk about the need for this leapfrogging for low-income countries, but they are using their money to make debt repayments. And a very simple way to help them with the financing needed for the leapfrogging that I completely support you is needed. I would disagree with you on a growth economy in the north, but that's a separate issue. I think low-income countries have the right to progress, as you say. They can't do it. They've never had the 100 billions promised, and now they're tied up with massive debt. We owe reparations on a massive scale, as was brought up in Jamaica with our own Prince William yesterday, for the damage we've done. And our industrial economy in Britain was the leader in the world, if you like, industrialization. So we're certainly in a position to lead the world on the question of reparations, both for the damage we've done in the past and to help them lead the way in the future. What do you think, Mr. Sharma?
Yes. Sorry, thank you, Lynn. Let me address the issue firstly on loss and damage, and then the whole issue of financing. So on loss and damage, I think we made some actually meaningful progress at this COP. And my personal view is that the mood music on this issue has been changing over the last couple of years. So what we managed to do was to get in place a program of work, which is sort of titled the Glasgow Dialogue, and you know, this will start later on this year, and it is a 4-year program. But clearly, by the time we get to Sharm el-Sheikh, countries will want to see some progress and some understanding of, you know, where this particular discussion is headed. But I think just the fact that we were able to get this on the table and get almost 200 countries to agree to this, I think that is progress. Not fast enough for some countries. I completely understand that, but you know, this is an issue where, as you know, there are sort of polarizing and differing views. The other thing that was really important for me was that whilst we you know, have this dialogue on loss and damage, what we also try and do is provide technical support to countries who face the issue of loss and damage. So there's a program of work called the Santiago Network that was started previously. What we managed to do at COP26 was to get agreement that we would get this operationalized by COP27, so that we will be able to ensure that countries can get you know, technical advice, because quite a lot of the time it's not always gathered in one place, and I think this will make a big difference. You raised the issue of you know, countries having to effectively rebuild. So one of the issues for instance, middle-income countries, some of the small island developing states, is that they are classed as middle-income countries, and therefore they've graduated away from being LDCs, and that means that you know, the climate finance money doesn't flow to them as they would like. Particularly, you know, there are countries where they'll be doing absolutely fine. You know, a hurricane will hit, and suddenly all the infrastructure is gone, and the only way that you are able to then rebuild is to borrow more. So this point about debt. There's been a lot of really good work done by the IMF and by Kristalina Georgieva, who leads it, on SDRs. And you will see, if you look at some of the cover decisions from coming out of COP26, is a very clear reference to SDRs also coming forward to support some of these middle-income countries. I think the overall issue on sort of debt, obviously that doesn't sit as part of the COP process, but what is important that we make sure that we get more finance flowing to these countries. And that's why I go back to this point that I made about public finance is never going to be enough. I mean, that's just the reality of it. The 100 billion has still not yet been met. I mean, it was due to be met in 2020. The OECD will report later on this year. But I mean, I think we can be sort of more or less certain that it wasn't met in 2020. Based on the work that we did ahead of COP and the climate finance report delivery plan that we published, we know that we will get there by 2023. We know that over that 5-year period from 2021 to 2025, there will be $500 billion mobilized from public sources. But that is not enough. It is going to need trillions of dollars of money deployed in developing countries to help them do this leapfrogging. Therefore, one of the things that we announced at COP was £8.5 billion for South Africa to help them as part of their clean energy transition away from coal. And what I hope will happen by the time we get to COP27 is that we will be in a position, developed countries will be in a position to announce a number of other such country deals as well to support other developing economies as well. Look, one of the things that I've always said is that you can make commitments, but a lot of it, unfortunately or fortunately, it has to be delivered through the mobilization of finance, and that's why that was such a key part of COP26, and that's why that's something that is very much on my agenda as we go forward throughout this year.
Oh, thanks for that. With this as the last question, and hopefully we can have a quick question and quick answer so we can meet our 6 o'clock deadline. But John Cummings, you've got a question about global carbon credits, which I think is worth touching on.
Yes, it's very pleasing that so many governments have made a commitment to reach net zero by 2050. But the IPCC's report made it clear that what really matters is the amount of carbon we emit in the process of getting there, the global carbon budget. And I haven't heard a single government anywhere talk about the global carbon budget. The setting of NDCs, as far as I can see, is independently done. There's no mechanism for coordinating them to say, do these commitments stay within the global carbon budget or not?
Alok.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, I mean, actually, countries have talked about the sort of overall sort of global carbon budget. I mean, that's what the whole discussion on common but differentiated responsibilities has been about at every COP for quite some years. One of the things that we did manage to do, actually a number of things we managed to do at this COP. One is, of course, we managed to close off the detailed rules on the Paris Agreement, the most difficult ones, which were left to the end. And again, I think people were rather surprised that we managed to close all of that off. And one of those was around transparency framework. And this is where countries need to report what it is that they have done in terms of emissions across different gases, across different sectors. And we got that agreement, right? We have managed to get almost 200 countries to agree to common reporting on the issue of emissions. So what we will see by 2024 is that reporting coming in from countries. And what we will then be able to do very clearly is to say, well, you've made these commitments on current trajectory. I'm afraid you're not going to get there. And this is actually about building international pressure on, big emitters as well. I mean, that's one of the things that you saw in the lead up to the Paris Agreement, where you saw smaller countries basically say that we need to get the 1.5 degrees recognized in the Paris Agreement, going into COP26. Very many of those countries, which are small economies, but on the front line of climate change, were very vocal as well. And you saw on the final day, the final hours, when we had the outcome that we did on coal phase out, where countries said they supported the overall deal because there was a lot in it, but on this particular issue they would have wanted collectively for us to go further. So there is a lot of international pressure around there, and I think the fact that we now have a transparency framework agreed, I think is actually really incredibly significant.
Thank you, Alok. We're going to finish it there. And Alok, thank you very much. What I want to say in this meeting is that to thank you also for the time you make available to my colleagues, to parliamentarians, to all of us. Most weeks you're in Parliament somewhere, just making sure that we keep on subject, because as you say, there's enormous pressure on very many other things. So thank you for that, and thank you for your wisdom and understanding, and for the massive drive and energy you have to get global, international countries to follow through with this. Thank you for your time today. I know you're hugely busy. You've already talked about your trip to Paris. I hope you have an evening and get a meal this evening. Thank you everybody for joining us. And next time we're meeting like this on the 21st of April to look at the bus fares pilot, £23.5 million from central government to actually really drive up bus usage in Cornwall. And tomorrow, don't look up at 2 o'clock at New Lynn Cinema if you're able to join us. But Alok, thank you so much.
It's a great film. It's a great film. I can highly recommend it, and it's got a proper moral message as well. Please go and watch it.
Brilliant. And I'll see you next week, Alok.
Thank you so much. Yes, Eric. Have a good weekend, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thanks. Thanks, Beth, for doing that. That's brilliant, getting us all together. Pippa, do you need a hand at all tomorrow with the unloading cakes and things?
No, I've my son becoming. Sorry.
There's a lot of really good points in the chat. Beth, is it? I'm trying to save it, but I can't. Could you save the chat and let us have it? Because a lot of people have put like references and information in. Is that possible?
I can definitely try. We'll definitely, the chat will be saved. We can try and check some of those really good links out. You're right, there's some really great knowledge, isn't there, in the group, and people sharing that.
We'll send Lynn, we'll send an email out with those various links. Further information.
That'd be lovely. Thank you, Derek. Thanks very much. I've already seen the movie, but I'll try and get to the discussion, which isn't in the movie place. It's in the hill, up the hill, isn't it?
Yes, it's in the centre.
What time is that? The chat, the meeting?
4:20.
4:20.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll see you there.
Thanks for that. Great. You'll need to email us if you want us to send out that information, the links. Brilliant. Thanks, everybody. Let's get off before we all start.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bye.
I'll see you at the Newland Centre.
Yes, lovely. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your time.
Bye.